The Rugby World Cup is right around the corner, and as an Irishman, I'm buzzing about our chances this year. However, we as a nation felt exactly the same way the last time the tournament was in France, back in 2007. 2007 was the first Rugby World Cup I watched. I'd never known international rugby to exist outside of the Six Nations, so coming off the excitement of my first FIFA World Cup, which had taken place in Germany the year before, when I learned that there was a Rugby World Cup too, I couldn't wait. I ate up every bit of content there was, from the newspaper previews, all the way to the Heineken ads on TV that made it seem like the biggest deal in sport. So for those of you who are a bit too young to remember, or for people like me who just want to indulge in a bit of nostalgia, this is what happened the last time the Rugby World Cup came to France. Starting with Pool A, which saw England come in as the defending world champions, but they were at that time probably the most beatable world champions in any team sport I'd ever seen. Ireland had beaten them in every Six Nations match I'd ever seen them play, most notably the 43-13 rout in Croke Park earlier that year. That showed itself in their second game when they were crushed 36-0 by South Africa. The Springboks were feeling pretty good about themselves, as they'd already stomped Samoa as well, with Brian Habana at the wheel. But then they faced Tonga, who were on a roll of their own. They had also started with 2 straight wins, including upsetting their Pacific rival Samoa 19-15. In an absolute belter, South Africa were taken to their limit, and as the clock went red, the Tongans had a glorious chance to snatch victory and a quarter-final place. But the chip didn't go quite their way, and South Africa escaped with their lives. Tonga also acquitted themselves well against England, but the champs did win in the end to take second place in the pool. Pool B belonged to Australia, who predictably finished top, but all the interesting stuff was happening underneath them. Wales were in the Jekyll and Hyde part of their history at that point, when you didn't know if they'd be contending for the Grand Slam or the wooden spoon year to year. They were 6 months away from sweeping the Six Nations for the second time in 4 years, but that was not the team we saw in France. There was a period during their first game against Canada when they were trailing by 17 points to 9, and their 32-20 defeat to the Wallabies was not as close as the final score suggests. Japan were in this pool as well, but they too were far from their glorious future. They were still value for money though, drawing 12-12 with Canada in a thriller, which came off the back of another barn burner with Fiji, which they narrowly lost 35-31. Speaking of the Fijians, they came up against Wales in the final game of the pool with real qualification hopes, and what unfolded was the game of the tournament to date. The underdogs flew out of the blocks, scoring 3 tries in the first 25 minutes to go 25-3 in front. By half time it was 25-10. Wales roared back in the second half with 19 points in the space of 7 minutes. However, they missed 7 very kickable points, and Fiji managed the 4th try to claim what is arguably still the biggest victory in the history of their team. We'll see how much has changed when they meet again this year, this time in Pool C. Speaking of Pool C, in 2007 it hosted New Zealand, the runaway pre-tournament favourites, and a team that to 8-year-old me seemed invincible. So how did they do? Well, they scored a combined 309 points in their 4 pool games, so you tell me. The second qualification spot was contested between Scotland and Italy, and the Italians held legitimate hopes of progressing, having beaten Scotland 37-17 in the Six Nations the previous February, where they famously raced into a 21-0 lead after just 7 minutes. The game was a competitive affair, but it was ultimately decided by the boot of Scotland's Chris Patterson for an 18-16 win. But it was the 2 other teams in the group that were maybe the most interesting of all. There were so many teams at this World Cup that I didn't even know played rugby. The likes of Japan, Canada, America. However, after 3 years of watching Six Nations rugby, I was most surprised to see 2 other European nations compete in the tournament: Romania and Portugal. It was Portugal's first time in the World Cup, and you could tell they were taking the most possible out of the experience by how they sang their national anthem. Furthermore, they inspired a whole generation of new players who will be in Portugal's second Rugby World Cup team this year. Ultimately, it was Romania who took the win by 14 points to 10, and they also ran Italy pretty close, earning a losing bonus point in a 24-18 defeat. Finally, Pool D, the pool that everyone expected to be a 2-horse race between Ireland and the hosts, France. But then Argentina came along and tore up the script in the very first match of the tournament. They spoiled the hosts' party on opening night, upsetting France by 17 points to 12, and that blew my mind at the time. Mainly because I didn't even know Argentina had a rugby team before that game, but more importantly, it was in that moment that I knew that Ireland weren't going to qualify. So much has since been written about what happened to Ireland in the 2007 World Cup and why and how it went the way it did. But for 8-year-old me, the scenario was very simple. I had never seen Ireland beat France. I just watched Vincent Clerc break our hearts in the first rugby match in Croke Park. And so if Argentina could do what we couldn't, what chance did we have against Argentina? However, I didn't need to worry about that because, as most know, our tournament managed to be a disaster all on its own. We first played Namibia, who performed shockingly well against us in the second half. But that doesn't compare to what was up next for us against Georgia. Ireland trailed for a substantial period of that game, and by the 75th minute, the Georgians were battering our line looking for a try that would give them the victory. It was like Japan versus South Africa in 2015, but if Japan hadn't got that winning try. Even so, the writing was on the wall, and in our third game we were battered by the French, who had recovered from their poor start. It was all or nothing in our final game against Argentina, but they kept us at bay for most of the first half, before sucker punching us with a try just before the break. It was over for us at that point, and Argentina won by double scores, 30-15, to seal top spot in the group. And so we move on to the knockout rounds, in a repeat of the final from 4 years previously that England won in the last minute of extra time. England hadn't been fully convincing in the pool stage, so it came as a bit of a surprise that they won this game. Not only that, but they dominated a lot of the first half, even if the Aussies had their noses in front for a spell, thanks to a 33rd minute try. Johnny Wilkinson overcame some early misses to carry his team from the tee to a narrow 12-10 victory. Next up, France versus New Zealand, and one of the best All Black haka's I've ever seen that really set the table for what was to come. New Zealand had steamrolled all before them up to that point, so it wasn't much of a surprise when they raced into a 10-0 lead inside 18 minutes and were up 13-3 by the half. Where most other teams would have wilted before the All Blacks though, France did not. Their second half performance could be summed up by this face Sebastian Chabal made in the face of the haka. They came alive in a flash after the restart, and only a blatant yellow card offence stopped them from touching down early. They eventually broke through 10 minutes later, and suddenly it was game on in a New Zealand match for the first time at the tournament. The All Blacks did force themselves over to go in front again, but they were losing more and more key players to injury as the game wore on. Then France broke the New Zealand line, and All Black fans will tell you to this day that this pass here was forward, but the TMO didn't call it, and France got the try, before converting to inch in front once more. The All Blacks hammered the French line looking for a winner, but for once they couldn't produce, and the match ended with the iconic image of Jean-Baptiste Elissalde sprinting away towards the sideline before booting the ball out of play, to the delirium of the home fans in Cardiff. Wait, Cardiff? Oh yeah, so I forgot to mention that France didn't actually have enough venues for the tournament, so they had to rely on Murrayfield and the Millennium Stadium to bail them out. Anyway, France were through to the semi-finals after a bona fide classic. If you're looking for one match to watch from this World Cup, it might very well be this one. If nothing else, do it to whet your appetite, because it'll be the opening match at this year's World Cup in Paris. Personally, I can't wait. The third quarter-final was Fiji-South Africa. The first half was fairly assured from the Springboks, and their 13-3 half-time lead looked pretty comfortable. The Fijians rallied in the second half, in much the same way France had the night before, and after an hour, it was 20-all. Could we have another Southern Hemisphere powerhouse shockingly eliminated? No, as it turned out, as the Springboks held their nerve when the All Blacks didn't, and rattled off 17 unanswered points in the final quarter. Finally, we had Argentina versus Scotland. I don't know what the expectations were for these teams going into the tournament, but I don't think many people had either one of them getting to the semis, so I'd say they both saw this as a major chance to exceed expectations. After a tight opening half hour, Argentina managed to block down a Scottish kick, and just like that they were over the line. Scotland managed to touch down themselves in the second half and take over the game, but the boot of Felipe Contepomi had given Argentina enough of a cushion, and they survived a late assault on their line to make the semi-finals for the first time in their history. The first semi-final was between France and England, and it seemed on paper that this was France's match to lose. After all, they were the reigning Six Nations champions, they were riding high after knocking out the All Blacks, and they were in front of their home fans in the Stade de France. However, England burst that balloon almost immediately, with an awkward bounce off a kick led to a try in the first 90 seconds. France recovered well enough though, and the remaining 78 minutes was the competitive affair that you would expect from an England-France encounter. The rest of the scores all came from place kicking, and when it was all said and done, the margin of victory was 5 points. The 5 points England had scored with the very first act of the game. Improbably, England were through to back-to-back Rugby World Cup finals, and Johnny Wilkinson was the English hero once again, sealing the win with a drop goal just like he did in the 2003 final. Meanwhile, the French were left stunned in front of their own fans. The other semi-final, South Africa versus Argentina, was not nearly as dramatic. The Springboks intercepted an Argentine pass for a try after 6.5 minutes to give them a lead they never looked in danger of relinquishing. They crowned a 37-13 win, with Brian Habana sealing the top try scorer award with his 8th of the competition. It was a bitterly disappointing result for Argentina, who deserved a more dignified exit from the tournament after the wonderful run they'd had. They got to end it on a positive note though, as they took third place with another win over France in the bronze final. This one even more decisive than the last, 34-10. This was the worst possible end to the tournament for France, which is perhaps why tempers boiled over at the end of the first half. Not only were they unable to avenge a surprise defeat, but they were beaten even more severely than last time. Maybe they were still shell-shocked at their failure to win the trophy on home soil, particularly after what they did to New Zealand. But 16 years later, they have a chance to put that right, and time will tell if they can do it. And so it came down to this. The 2007 Rugby World Cup final. England versus South Africa. And truth be told, 8-year-old me was not excited for this game. I'd already seen South Africa put an absolute beating on England earlier in the competition, and so for me, the result was a foregone conclusion. The match was actually a much tighter affair than before, with all the points coming from penalties. England could, and probably should, have had a try earlier in the second half, but it was chalked off when the TMO said there was an English foot in touch, a decision vehemently protested by England fans and players. South Africa went on to win the game by 15 points to 6, but who knows if the tide would have turned on that try. I think the Springboks' winning margin probably would have held up. In any event, South Africa were Rugby World Champions for the second time, and would add a third crown by beating England again in 2019, albeit far more decisively on that occasion. 16 years later, a lot of things are the same. The Southern Hemisphere teams are still heavily fancied, as well as the top Six Nations teams like France and Ireland. But a lot has changed as well. For instance, Japan have stepped up to become a Tier 1 rugby nation. And while North America had plenty of representation in 2007, 2023 will see the turn of South America to make their presence felt. Argentina are not to be underestimated anymore, of course, but Uruguay will be there for the third tournament in a row, and Chile will make their first ever appearance, just like Portugal did in 2007. All in all, in the words of former HBO boxing analyst Larry Merchant, there are lots of questions to be answered and there are lots of answers to be questioned.